The blistering noon sun carved shadows, like knife blades across the dusty main street of Redemption Falls. Heat waves shimmered off weathered wooden buildings, distorting the air until the whole town seemed to waver like a desert mirage. But there was nothing illusory about the pillory standing in the town square, a medieval relic of punishment, its wooden stalks stained dark with the sweat and tears of countless souls who had been locked within its cruel embrace. Today, those stalks held a woman whose bronze skin gleamed with perspiration, her long black hair hanging in damp strands around a face etched with exhaustion and desperation. Sarah Naira Blackhorse, though the townspeople cared nothing for her. Name had been trapped there since dawn, her wrists and neck locked tight in the unforgiving wooden restraints. Above her, carrion crows circled in lazy spirals, their harsh cries the only sound in the oppressive silence. The Apache woman's lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. Her calico dress, once modest and clean, now clung to her body with sweat and dust. Every few minutes, she would lift her head as far as the stalks would allow and whisper hoarse pleas to the empty street. But the good citizens of Redemption Falls had made their position clear. They would not acknowledge the existence of the woman they considered nothing more than a savage and a thief. As the sun climbed higher, Naira's strength began to fail. Her head lolled forward, dark hair falling like a curtain across her face. The metal hinges of the pillory had rubbed her wrists raw, and tiny droplets of blood mixed with the dust beneath the wooden platform. She was dying by degrees, and everyone knew it. That was the point. Then, cutting through the oppressive quiet like thunder before a storm, came the steady rhythm of horse hooves on packed earth. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the soft jingle of spurs and the creak of well-worn leather. A lone rider approached from the east, his silhouette wavering in the heat haze until he resolved into solid reality, a man perhaps 30 years old, wearing a battered hat and a long brown duster coat that had seen too many miles of hard country. Samuel Clayton rode his chestnut mare with the easy confidence of someone who had spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground. His weathered hands held the reins with casual expertise, and his pale blue eyes missed nothing as they swept across the apparently deserted town. But when his gaze fell upon the pillory and its occupant, something changed in his expression. The easy lines around his eyes hardened, and his jaw tightened beneath several days' worth of dark stubble. The Apache woman sensed his presence before she saw him. Some primal instinct made her lift her head, and when their eyes met across the dusty square, something electric passed between them. Here was no townsperson to avert their gaze in righteous indignation. Here was a man whose eyes held recognition of her humanity, even as they also held the wariness of someone who had learned that kindness could be a dangerous luxury in a hard world. "Water," she whispered, her voice barely audible, even in the perfect stillness. "Please, water." Clayton's mare stomped nervously, as if sensing her rider's inner turmoil. The cowboy's hand moved instinctively toward the canteen hanging from his saddle horn, then stopped. He knew what helping her would mean. In a town like this, there were rules, and those rules were enforced with rope and iron. But as he looked at the woman's cracked lips and the way her whole body trembled with exhaustion, something inside him made the decision before his mind could interfere. He swung down from the saddle with fluid grace, his boots raising small puffs of dust as they hit the ground. The Apache woman's eyes followed his every movement, hope and fear warring in their dark depths. Clayton approached the pillory slowly, his spurs chiming softly with each step, until he stood close enough to see the intricate beadwork on what remained of her torn sleeve, close enough to smell the scent of sage and cedar smoke that seemed to cling to her hair despite her ordeal. "I'm stuck," she breathed, the words carrying a weight far beyond their simple meaning. "Please free me from the pillory, cowboy." The plea hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything decent people were supposed to believe about right and wrong, about civilization and savagery, about the natural order of things in the American West of 1897. Clayton's blue eyes searched her face, looking for deception, for the signs of guilt that would make walking away easier. Instead, he saw only exhaustion, pain, and a desperate hope that made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Behind them, wooden shutters began to creak open. Eyes peered out from darkened windows. Word was spreading through Redemption Falls like wildfire. A stranger had stopped at the pillory. A stranger was talking to the Apache thief, The unthinkable was happening. Clayton unscrewed the cap of his canteen with deliberate slowness, never taking his eyes off the woman's face. When he lifted it to her lips, she drank with the desperate gratitude of someone who had been wandering in the desert for days. Water ran down her chin and dripped onto the wooden platform, each drop disappearing instantly into the thirsty wood. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice rough with disuse. "Too much too fast will make you sick." She nodded, understanding, but her eyes never left his face. "They say I stole cattle," she whispered when he pulled the canteen away. "They lie. Most folks around these parts would say an Apache's word ain't worth the air it takes to speak it," Clayton replied. But there was no condemnation in his voice, only a statement of brutal fact. "And you?" she asked, her voice gaining strength with each word. "What do you say, cowboy?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching boots echoed across the square. 4 men emerged from the shadows of the general store, their faces set in the hard lines of men who had been challenged and found the challenge wanting. Leading them was Sheriff Marcus Webb, a thick-set man whose badge gleamed silver against his black vest. His hand rested casually on the butt of his revolver, and his small brown eyes fixed on Clayton with unmistakable hostility. "Move along, stranger," Webb called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Nothing here concerns you." Clayton didn't move, didn't even turn around. Instead, he kept his attention focused on the woman in the pillory, studying the intelligence in her dark eyes, the proud set of her shoulders despite her circumstances. "Seems to me," he said conversationally, "that when a human being is locked up like an animal and left to die of thirst, it concerns every decent person who happens by." The words hit the approaching men like a physical blow. Webb's face flushed red above his graying beard, and the 3 townsmen behind him muttered curses under their breath. One of them, a thin man with nervous eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "That there's a cattle thief, mister," Webb said, his voice growing harder with each word. "Caught red-handed with a branded calf she had no business possessing. Around here, we believe in swift justice for those who take what ain't theirs." "Swift justice," Clayton repeated, finally turning to face the sheriff. His movement was casual, unhurried, but there was something in his posture that made the other men step back slightly. "That what you call locking a woman up to die without a trial?" "She had her trial," snapped the thin man. "Judge Morrison heard all the evidence yesterday afternoon." Clayton's pale eyes shifted to the speaker, taking in his expensive clothes and soft hands. "You'd be Thomas Garrett, I'm guessing. Own the double diamond spread?" Garrett's nervous eyes widened slightly. "How did you?" "Lucky guess." Clayton's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Funny thing about cattle theft usually takes more than one person to move a herd. But I don't see anybody else in that pillory." "The others got away," Webb interjected quickly. "She was the only one we caught." "Convenient," Clayton observed. He turned back to the Apache woman, whose dark eyes were following the conversation with keen intelligence despite her exhaustion. "What's your name?" "Sarah Naira Blackhorse," she replied, pronouncing each syllable with careful dignity. "I did not steal any cattle." "Sarah Naira?" Clayton repeated thoughtfully. "Pretty name for a cattle thief." He looked back at Webb, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me, Sheriff, exactly what evidence did Judge Morrison hear at this trial?" Webb's jaw worked silently for a moment, and Clayton noticed how the other men avoided eye contact. Finally, the sheriff found his voice. "Garrett here found her with one of his calves. Had a rope around its neck and everything." "Interesting," Clayton mused. He pulled out a tobacco pouch and began rolling a cigarette with steady hands, seemingly oblivious to the tension crackling in the air around him. "Miss Sarah Naira, would you care to tell your side of this story?" The Apache woman's voice was stronger now, fueled by the water and the first hint of hope she had felt in 24 hours. "I found the calf caught in barbed wire near the creek. It was hurt, bleeding. I cut it free and was leading it back toward the ranch when Mr. Garrett and his men found me." "Convenient story," Garrett sneered. "Who's going to believe the word of a squaw?" The ugly word hung in the air like a curse, and Clayton's hands went very still. When he looked up from his tobacco, his blue eyes had gone ice cold. "I wouldn't use that word again if I were you, Garrett. Not while I'm standing here." The threat was delivered so quietly that it took a moment for its full impact to register. When it did, Garrett took an involuntary step backward, his face pale beneath his hat brim. The other townsmen shifted nervously, suddenly aware that they might be dealing with something far more dangerous than a drifting cowboy. Webb's hand tightened on his gun butt. "You threatening a citizen of this town, stranger?" Clayton struck a match and lit his cigarette, taking a long draw before answering. When he exhaled, the smoke drifted between him and the sheriff like a challenge. "Name's Clayton, Samuel Clayton, and I'm not threatening anybody, Sheriff. Just expressing my opinion about men who use words like that to describe a lady." "Lady?" One of the townsmen laughed harshly. "She's nothing but a—" "Choose your next words very carefully," Clayton interrupted, his voice cutting through the man's bluster like a blade. "Because I've got a strong feeling Miss Sarah Naira here is more of a lady than this town deserves." The Apache woman stared at him with something approaching wonder. In her 25 years of life, she had never heard a white man defend her honor, had never seen one willing to face down an entire town for her sake. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying because she knew what it meant for both of them. Sheriff Webb sensed the shifting dynamics of the confrontation and decided to reassert his authority before things spiraled completely out of control. "Look here, Clayton, I don't know what your game is, but you're not welcome in Redemption Falls. I suggest you mount up and ride on before there's trouble." Clayton took another drag of his cigarette, studying the sheriff's face with the patient attention of a man reading the weather. "Trouble's already here, Webb. Question is whether we're going to solve it like civilized people or if it's going to get ugly." "What do you mean, solve it?" Webb demanded. "I mean, I want to hear both sides of this story before an innocent woman dies of thirst in your town square." Clayton flicked ash from his cigarette, his movements casual, but his attention focused on every man around him. "Seems to me there are some questions that need answering." Garrett stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "There are no questions, gunfighter. That woman was caught with my property. She's a thief, and thieves get punished. It's as simple as that." "Nothing's ever simple when it comes to taking a life," Clayton replied. "And make no mistake, leaving her locked up in this heat without water is murder, pure and simple." The word murder landed among the townsmen like a thunderbolt. They had convinced themselves they were dispensing justice, upholding the law, protecting their community from thieves and savages. To have their actions labeled as murder by this steel-eyed stranger was both shocking and infuriating. Sarah Naira watched the exchange with growing amazement. This man, this Clayton, was putting his life on the line for her, a stranger he had never seen before today. She could see the way his hand rested near his gun, could sense the coiled violence beneath his calm exterior. He was preparing to fight the entire town if necessary, and she couldn't understand why. "Mr. Clayton," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a prayer. "You don't know me. Why would you risk yourself for someone like me?" He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his pale eyes that took her breath away. Not pity, not condescension, but a kind of recognition that went soul deep. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stand by and do nothing while others suffer," he said simply. "And I swore a long time ago that I wouldn't be one of them." The sheriff had heard enough. His patience, never his strongest virtue, had finally run out. "That's it," he declared, his voice harsh with authority. "Clayton, you're under arrest for interfering with the lawful punishment of a convicted criminal." Clayton's smile was thin and humorless. "On what charge?" "Disturbing the peace will do for starters." "Whose peace am I disturbing, Sheriff? Town seems pretty quiet to me." The exchange was interrupted by the sound of running feet. A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, came racing around the corner of the general store, his face flushed with excitement and fear. He skidded to a stop when he saw the tense confrontation in the square, his wide eyes taking in the armed men facing each other like gunslingers at high noon. "Sheriff Webb!" the boy gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "Sheriff, come quick! Mr. Morrison wants to see you right away." Webb frowned, irritated by the interruption. "What does the judge want, Billy?" The boy glanced nervously at the men surrounding him, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. He didn't say, "Sheriff, just told me to find you and bring you to his office right away." Said it was about the Indian woman. A chill ran through the assembled men. Judge Morrison was not a man given to second thoughts or sudden changes of heart. If he wanted to see the sheriff about Naira Blackhorse, something significant had changed. Clayton dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel, never taking his eyes off the sheriff's face. Sounds like the judge might have something interesting to say about this case. Webb's jaw worked silently as he weighed his options. Finally, he turned to his deputies. Keep an eye on our friend Clayton here. Make sure he doesn't try anything stupid while I'm gone. Actually, Clayton said conversationally, I think I'll come with you. Always interested in what judges have to say about justice. Like hell you will, Webb snarled. Sheriff, Naira called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square despite her exhaustion. If Judge Morrison wants to discuss my case, don't I have the right to hear what he has to say? The question caught Webb off guard. In the heat of the confrontation, he had almost forgotten that the woman was still locked in the pillory, still technically under the jurisdiction of the court. The law was murky on the subject of a condemned person's rights during punishment, but Webb was no legal scholar. Clayton sensed the sheriff's uncertainty and pressed his advantage. Seems reasonable to me. After all, it's her life we're talking about. Before Webb could respond, another voice cut through the tension. That's quite enough, gentlemen. Everyone turned to see Judge Morrison himself approaching from the direction of his office, his black robes billowing behind him like the wings of some great bird of prey. He was a tall, thin man with iron-gray hair and the kind of lined face that came from making hard decisions for 40 years. His pale eyes swept over the assembled crowd before settling on the pillory and its occupant. Your Honor, Webb began, but Morrison silenced him with a raised hand. I've just received some very disturbing information about yesterday's trial, the judge announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Information that calls into question the validity of the verdict. The words hit the townsman like physical blows. Garrett went pale beneath his hat, and the other men shifted nervously, suddenly finding the ground at their feet fascinating. Clayton felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. What kind of information, Your Honor? Morrison's gaze fixed on him with laser intensity. And you are? Samuel Clayton. Just a concerned citizen who happened to witness what appeared to be an execution without due process. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Execution? That's a rather dramatic interpretation of our justice system, Mr. Clayton. Is it? Clayton gestured toward the pillory, where Naira sat motionless in the blazing Sunday. How long has she been locked up without water? How long before the heat and thirst kill her? Seems like execution to me. Morrison walked over to the pillory and studied the Apache woman carefully. Her head was bowed, her breathing shallow and rapid. Even from a distance, he could see the raw wounds on her wrists, where the wooden stocks had rubbed her skin away. Miss Blackhorse, he said softly, can you hear me? Naira lifted her head with tremendous effort, her dark eyes struggling to focus on the judge's face. Yes, Your Honor. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer them truthfully. Do you understand? She nodded weakly. Did you steal Thomas Garrett's calf? No, Your Honor. I found it caught in wire. I was trying to help it. Morrison turned to Garrett, who was now sweating despite the fact that he stood in the shade of the general store's overhang. Mr. Garrett, I've just spoken with your neighbor, Robert Hayes. He has some interesting things to say about your recent land disputes with the Apache reservation. Garrett's face went from pale to red and back to pale again. I don't know what you're talking about, Judge. Don't you? Morrison's voice was soft, dangerous. Hayes says you've been trying to expand your ranch onto reservation land for months. Says you've been looking for an excuse to make trouble with the Apache, something that would give you leverage with the territorial government. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a forest fire. Clayton felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind, but he remained silent, letting the judge work. Hayes also says, Morrison continued, that the calf in question belongs to him, not you. Says it wandered off his property 3 days ago, and he's been looking for it ever since. Garrett's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping on dry land. The other townsmen took unconscious steps away from him, suddenly unwilling to be associated with his scheme. Furthermore, the judge said, his voice rising slightly, Hayes is prepared to testify that you asked him to let you claim ownership of the calf if it was found. Told him it would help you solve the Indian problem once and for all. The sheriff looked like a man who had just watched his world collapse around him. Thomas, tell me this isn't true. But Garrett's silence was answer enough. The rancher turned and began walking rapidly toward his horse, tied at the hitching post in front of the saloon. His movements were jerky, desperate, like a man who had suddenly realized his carefully laid plans were unraveling. "Stop right there, Garrett," Morrison commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. The rancher broke into a run. Clayton moved without conscious thought, his hand dropping to his gun and drawing it in one fluid motion. The Colt appeared in his grip as if by magic, its barrel tracking Garrett's fleeing form with mechanical precision. "That's far enough," Clayton called out, his voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Garrett skidded to a halt, his hands raised slowly above his head. When he turned around, his face was the color of old parchment, and his eyes held the desperate look of a cornered animal. "This is all a mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "You don't understand the situation here. These Apache have been stealing cattle for years. Someone had to do something about it." "Someone did," Clayton replied, never wavering in his aim. "They framed an innocent woman and tried to murder her in broad daylight." Judge Morrison approached the pillory with a set of keys that had appeared from somewhere within his black robes. "Miss Blackhorse, I apologize on behalf of this community for the injustice you have suffered. You are hereby released from custody, and all charges against you are dropped." The locks clicked open one by one, and Sarah Naira's arms fell free for the first time in over 24 hours. She swayed as the circulation returned to her cramped limbs, and Clayton was there instantly to steady her. His gun still trained on Garrett, but his attention focused on the woman who was trying to stand on unsteady legs. "Easy," he murmured, his arm around her waist as she struggled to regain her balance. "You've been locked up for a long time. Take it slow." She leaned against him gratefully, feeling the solid warmth of his body through his shirt. His scent was leather and tobacco and something indefinably masculine that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with her recent ordeal. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying a weight of meaning that went far beyond simple gratitude. Clayton looked down at her, taking in the proud line of her jaw, the intelligence that sparked in her dark eyes despite her exhaustion. "Thank me when we're both safely out of town," he replied, but his voice was gentle. Sheriff Webb was staring at Garrett as if he had never seen him before. "Thomas, how could you do this? How could you let me arrest an innocent woman?" Garrett's desperation finally broke through his fear. "Innocent?" he screamed. "She's not innocent. None of them are innocent. They're savages, and they're taking over our land, piece by piece, day by day. Someone had to make a stand." The raw hatred in his voice made Sarah Naira flinch, and Clayton felt her tremble against his side. His jaw tightened, and his finger moved slightly on the trigger of his Colt. "That's enough," he said quietly, but his voice carried a warning that made Garrett step back. Judge Morrison had heard enough as well. "Thomas Garrett, you are under arrest for perjury, conspiracy, and attempted murder." "Sheriff Webb, I want him locked up immediately." "Your Honor," Webb began hesitantly. "About the attempted murder charge. The man deliberately gave false testimony that resulted in a woman being sentenced to death by exposure," Morrison snapped. "If that's not attempted murder, I don't know what is." As Webb reluctantly approached Garrett with a pair of handcuffs, Clayton holstered his weapon and turned his full attention to Sarah Naira. She was standing steadier now, but he could see the exhaustion in every line of her body. "Miss Sarah Naira," he said formally, "would you allow me to escort you somewhere safe?" She looked up at him, searching his face for signs of the ulterior motives she had learned to expect from white men. Instead, she found only genuine concern and something else, something that made her pulse quicken despite her weariness. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted quietly. "My people. They live far from here, and I don't have the strength to travel alone." Clayton nodded thoughtfully. "There's a boarding house run by a Mexican woman named Maria Santos about 10 miles north of here. She's got a reputation for taking in strays and asking no questions. You could rest there, get your strength back." "And then what?" Sarah Naira asked. "Even with Garrett in jail, there will be others like him. There always are." The truth of her words hit Clayton like a physical blow. Even with her name cleared, even with the real culprit behind bars, Sarah Naira Blackhorse would never be truly safe in a world where her skin color marked her as less than human in the eyes of too many people. Then you make a choice, he said finally. You can live in fear, always looking over your shoulder, always waiting for the next Thomas Garrett to come along. Or you can decide to stand up and fight back. Fight back? She laughed. But there was no humor in the sound. I'm one Apache woman in a territory full of people who would be happy to see me dead. What kind of fight is that? Clayton was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that rose like purple shadows on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The only kind of fight worth having, he said. The kind where you choose to be who you are instead of who they want you to be. As Sheriff Webb led Thomas Garrett away in handcuffs, the small crowd that had gathered began to disperse. Some of the townspeople looked ashamed, their eyes downcast as they hurried back to their businesses and homes. Others wore expressions of resentment, clearly unhappy with the way events had unfolded but unwilling to challenge the judge's authority. Judge Morrison approached Clayton and Sarah Naira, his lined face grave. Miss Blackhorse, I cannot undo the suffering you've endured, but I can offer you this if you choose to press charges against those who participated in this injustice. The territorial court will hear your case. Sarah Naira considered the offer carefully. The idea of seeing her tormentors brought to justice was appealing, but she also knew the reality of what such a trial would mean. Months of testimony, of reliving this nightmare over and over again, of facing hostile witnesses and unsympathetic juries. Thank you, Your Honor, she said finally. But I think I've had enough of courtrooms for a while. Morrison nodded understandingly. The offer stands if you change your mind. He turned to Clayton, studying the cowboy with shrewd eyes. Mr. Clayton, you showed considerable courage today. This community owes you a debt of gratitude. No debt, Clayton replied simply. Just did what needed doing. The judge smiled slightly. If more people shared that philosophy, the world would be a better place. He tipped his hat to both of them and walked away, his black robes rustling in the afternoon breeze. Clayton and Sarah Naira stood alone in the square, the silence between them comfortable despite everything that had happened. She was studying his profile, trying to understand this man who had risked everything for a stranger, while he was lost in thought, planning their next moves. Why? She asked suddenly. Why did you help me? Clayton turned to look at her, and she saw something in his pale eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. My father was a preacher, he said quietly. Spent most of my childhood listening to him talk about good Samaritans and turning the other cheek. Never paid much attention to it then. And now? Now I figure maybe he was onto something. He gestured toward his horse, still patiently waiting at the hitching rail. We should get moving. It'll be dark soon, and I'd rather not spend the night in a town where half the people want to see you back in that pillory. Sarah Naira nodded, but made no move toward the horse. Instead, she continued to study Clayton's face, memorizing the lines around his eyes, the way his mouth curved when he was thinking, the small scar that ran along his left cheekbone. What? He asked, noticing her scrutiny. I'm trying to figure you out, she admitted. In my experience, white men who help Apache women usually want something in return. Clayton's expression hardened slightly. I'm not most white men. No, she agreed softly. You're not. He offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Together, they walked toward his horse, their footsteps echoing in the empty square. As they moved, Sarah Naira became increasingly aware of the man beside her, his height, his strength, the easy confidence of his movements. She found herself wondering what it would be like to travel with him, to see the world through his eyes, to learn what had made him into the kind of man who would stand up to an entire town for a stranger. Clayton helped her mount behind him, his hands gentle but sure as he lifted her onto the horse's back. When she settled herself and wrapped her arms around his waist, he felt the rapid beating of her heart against his back and the way her body trembled slightly with exhaustion and reaction. Hold tight, he murmured, and she did, pressing herself against his solid warmth as he nudged the horse into motion. As they rode out of Redemption Falls, neither of them looked back at the pillory standing empty in the town square. But both of them carried the memory of this day, and of each other, burned into their hearts like a brand that would never fade. Behind them, The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise both endings and beginnings in the vast expanse of the American frontier.